Welcome to all our listeners. Ubuntunomics is a weekly roundup and discussion of the most important economic and political developments from Africa. Hosted by myself, Sia from PESA. PESA is a political economy think tank that promotes regional integration in SADC and provides research on the political economy of development in Africa. With me is my co-host, Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Isakombe Assets provides individuals with renewable energy assets in order to develop communities.
Hello, Spoo. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you, man. How are you today, Sia?
I'm very well, thank you. I can't complain. So, what do you have for us in store from South Africa this week?
Our first story is the response to ratings actions by Fitch and S&P Global Ratings. Standard & Poor's Global Ratings affirmed South Africa's long-term foreign and local currency debt ratings at BB and maintained a stable outlook, while Fitch affirmed a debt rating at BB minus and maintained a negative outlook. According to S&P, South Africa is experiencing a cyclical uplift from the economic contraction in 2020 and improving terms of trade from higher commodity prices. However, structural constraints, a weak pace of economic reforms, and slow vaccination rates will continue to constrain medium-term economic growth and limit the government's ability to contain the debt to GDP ratio. According to Fitch, South Africa's rating is constrained by high and rising government debt, low trend growth, and exceptionally high inequality that will complicate consolidation efforts. Government acknowledges the pressures and remains committed to fast-track growth-enhancing strategies, the implementation of critical reforms that raise economic growth and to improve fiscal sustainability. That's the first story. Yeah. Our next story from South Africa is the basic income grant. In her budget vote 19 speech to the National Assembly, Minister of Social Development, Ms. Lindiwe Zulu, made the announcement that the ministry will be finalizing the policy on the basic income grant for tabling to cabinet. She mentioned that the need to introduce the basic income grant, which is also called the BIG, has become an urgent consideration for the African National Congress-led government. To this end, the department has developed a BIG discussion document that they have started consultations on. These consultations are targeted at developing the BIG financing mechanism for the unemployed population group that is aged between 19 and 59 years.
So, here's my question to you, Spoo. What are your views on the BIG? What do you think? Do you think that this really deals with the problems of poverty, unemployment, and inequality in South Africa? What do you think in terms of its as a policy, but also as a response to some of these challenges that I've highlighted?
I'll tell you what I've noticed is that this form is not called the Universal Basic Income Grant, which is the provision of a standard paycheck to anyone, whether they are rich or poor, that type is unconditional and cuts right across. Even a guy like a billionaire like Johan Rupert or Patrice Motsepe would be given a stipend. Be that as it may, this one is called the basic income grant. They just trying to, hence the 15 to 50, the 15 to 50, the 19 to 59 years age.
The age restriction, yeah.
They will concentrate on. Yeah. The truth basically is that the basic income grant is a neoliberal policy that seeks to dumb down calls and demands for an equitable share in the incomes by the marginalized people of South Africa. The BIG is a surrender basically to the proposition that mass unemployment is inevitable. And all the government should do is that just keep the people alive with some form of a guaranteed income. It is the abandonment of, or maybe I'd say the perversion of the concept of full employment in South Africa. The evidence is that there's ample evidence that when an economy is maintained at high levels of employment, workers in low-paying sectors or occupations also receive income boosts because employers seeking to meet the strong labor demand offer employment and training opportunities to the most disadvantaged in the population. If the economy falters, these groups are the most severely hit in terms of lost income opportunities, as was the case during this past COVID-19 economic downturn. So what amazes me here is that even the so-called progressives in our country claim we have moved beyond a time when everyone who desires a job can have one. And so they say in typical neoliberal surrender mode, they think it's being innovative. They are being innovative by advocating for this basic income grant solution. What is curious though is that NEDLAC, which is a body with both business, labor, and government, where they all join to discuss these matters. It's also calling for the BIG. The disillusionment in this is that there is record high unemployment rates, and so this has ushered in a time when progressive are causing upward to our country's oligarchs. And I don't want to mention supposedly progressive labor federations like COSATU or the South African Communist Party at this juncture, because they've also fallen for the trick. The goal is for oligarchs to suppress wages and working conditions, to turn the South African working and poor classes into crass consumers riddled by diabetes and high blood pressure as we buy animal offal and high starch cheap foods.
It's really irking you. So here's what I think. So my problem with this policy proposal is that even from a neoliberal point of view, I don't understand how it's going to solve the problems that we face, right? So South Africa is known for the trifecta or trilemma, the three problems, right? High unemployment, high inequality, and a high poverty rate, right? And if from a neoliberal sense, right, let's say, for example, the BIG is filling the gap that employment would fill otherwise, right? So let's assume that that's the main incentive or response that the BIG policy is aimed at. So how does that impact now job creation? So the problem with this is that by providing a sort of grant stimulus that's supposed to be a floor in terms of income for everybody, you inadvertently raise what is the reservation wage for everybody at the same time, right? So from a neoliberal point of view, unemployment is caused by the fact that the competitive wage or the wage in the market falls below people's reservation wage, right? So that's the one form of unemployment. So inevitably, in a neoliberal sense, people either have to accept the low wages or have to choose unemployment. However, when you provide a basic income grant, you're actually lifting the reservation wage for all people, because take the 350 Rand COVID grant, for example. If in the instance of, or in the absence of the 350 Rand grant, those people who are recipients of the grants would be able to take on any work that would provide them 350 Rand in a month. Yes, obviously that's below the national minimum wage and, you know, below any kind of standard. So, okay, firstly, that policy in itself seems ineffective because it falls way below any kind of spectrum. Secondly, the basic income grant now, as I've said, lifts the reservation wage, which means a lot more people are going to choose the grant over any kind of employment that would pay below the basic income grant, which then raises a question as what level are you going to set the basic income grant at? Because if you set it below the national minimum wage level, effectively you're actually signaling to the market that, at least from a government point of view, people can survive on less than the minimum wage, right?
Yes, yeah.
And that is the only way in which the basic income grant is not going to raise the reservation wage of people. And if you pay at the level of minimum wage or above, you are then actually undermining employment, at least at the bottom of the income brackets, because you have raised the reservation wage. So people would much rather than take employment that pays them a minimum wage, would much rather take the basic income grant. And so it seems as though you have a dilemma. For the basic income grant to make any impact on a person's life, I would assume it has to meet the minimum wage standard, right? Because the minimum wage standard is supposedly linked to decent employment, but also the livelihoods and expectations that this is what the very minimum that people need in order to survive. And so you have to set a BIG above the minimum wage, or at least at the minimum wage level, which in that case undermines unemployment. So for me, if that's the case, then the government is actually spending money ineffectively, because I would much rather have a government that spends that money on other ways in order to support, let's say, small and medium enterprises, who are by and large the major employers in the country, or in other ways in order to lift the social wage for people. Lifting the social wage can come in the form of increased public spending on healthcare, on public health, or on public education, such that people don't feel the need to access private education or private healthcare, and can actually use the public services, which in a way lifts the social wage. So I think I agree with you when you say it is a kind of cop-out on the idea of full employment, that we will never reach full employment. We now just accept that there is a certain minimum structural unemployment level in South Africa, and that we cannot do anything about it, but literally just save those people from dying from starvation and other kind of social ills. And as a policy instrument, is neither forward-looking nor is it positive in the sense of enabling decent lives or enabling people to come out of poverty. So those are really the kind of problems that I have with the policy from an initial point of view, at least.
Knowing South Africa, even the BIG stipends they propose will be too low for mass consumption to continue without further credit expansion. They will offer. What will happen is that they'll keep offering credit through people, through stores like Jet stores for clothing and low-cost retail stores like Boxer for food. Our people will continue to wallow in under high debt levels. Even the concept of or the theory, our theory of Ubuntunomics, is that we should keep striving for participation and wealth creation through some sort of ownership, however little that is. I mean, the aim for a post-colonial and post-apartheid society like ours is to revive a sense of worth, people who contribute to society. the PIG doesn't do this. It doesn't build self-esteem because the mega income doesn't depend on anyone's efforts. It is almost some permanent, and only it only creates dependency, hoping that every year the finance minister, if he's in the right mood, he will increase by he would, yeah. So basically what I'm saying is that we have a saying, umuntu ngabantu, I am because you are. It is based on the centrality of value and innate human value. Yeah, the saying all goes hand in glove with another one that says like every frog does his own jumping, or something like
and all those philosophies are linked to, you know, what we used to call back in the day vukuzenzele, you know, which was an approach where government aimed to enable South Africans to help themselves in a way. So I think let's delve in a little bit in terms of like what it would take for South Africans to be brought out of poverty and you know, reduce unemployment and inequality. For me, I don't think we can speak of any kind of capital accumulation or wealth accumulation without speaking about property and access to land. I think that is the first starting point. So I think all of this, you know, the BIG, it's almost as if we're putting a band-aid on a volcano that's erupting. And we're just hoping that the band-aid is going to stop the lava from flowing through and destroying everyone. And so the starting point is land, access to land, because that is the only way that people can accumulate capital or can accumulate wealth that can be handed over from one generation to the next. The second thing is we've got to focus on small and medium enterprises, and this requires us to deal with the market from a competition point of view in order to create space and reduce the barriers for new entrants. Secondly, we need to also support the informal sector. You know, one of the big things that I've been discussing coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic and where we are as an economy is that a large part of the destruction of the COVID-19 pandemic, yes, it did affect the formal economy, but it was even worse for the informal economy. The sad part, though, is that, you know, the informal economy generally goes by without being recorded. And as such, what we're already starting to see is people saying, well, the pandemic was bad, but it was better than we expected, precisely because they're not measuring the informal sector and the destruction that took place there. And so it's upon our government then to find innovative ways in ensuring that, you know, we support the informal sector, because that is how the majority poor black people make an income. And secondly, we support small and medium enterprises by opening up the market space, but also providing other means of support in order to ensure that we have a thriving small business sector that will generate the jobs. I don't think that we'll ever deal with the poverty and inequality by just providing social welfare, which isn't enabling in terms of social mobility for people to move out of poverty. And it just keeps people on a spiral of poverty. So for me, it really takes those couple of steps that I've highlighted.
Exactly. Okay, we can go on and on about that one, but it is a topic that is close to our hearts. I think we should move on to our next stories here.
Sure.
Our next story is on Eskom reduces debt by 83 billion rand. After tabling the Department of Public Enterprises budget vote during a mini plenary at the National Assembly, Minister Pravin Gordhan informed the media that the country's power utility Eskom had made a 83 billion rand reduction in debt in the 2021 financial year. The state-owned company's debt was reduced to 401 billion rand due to the repayment of the maturing debt and changes in the exchange rate. The management of Eskom's debt, he said, is one of the key priorities to return the entity onto a sustainable path. He said more effort is needed to bring down municipal debt. Eskom's consumer debt continues to escalate, which currently stands at 45 billion rand, of which 78% is owed by municipalities, 17% by the township of Soweto.
Interesting. And, relatively, people have always said that Soweto is to blame for the huge challenge of load shedding and Eskom's public debt. But when you look at it, 17% or 20% or a fifth of around 50 billion, which itself is less than, an eighth of the 401 billion total public debt, really the Soweto debt is not that big. It's just that people like to blame Soweto or black people generally for all the problems we face in the country. My other issue with this, though, is that they seem to be playing accounting games, right, or balance sheet games. And, of the 83 billion, it would be interesting to see how much of that is actually attributed to actual payment of the debt by Eskom, which I assume could be significant. But given the appreciation of the rand from where we were at 15.50 last year per US dollar to where we are now at less than 14 rands per dollar, I can imagine that a significant chunk of that 83 billion is actually appreciation of the rand rather than the actual payment of debt. But anyway, that's a story for another day.
Our next story is the government to intervene in the Vaal River system. Human Settlements, Water and Sanitation Minister Lindiwe Sisulu says, pending a decision from Cabinet, the department will invoke a clause of the Water Services Act of 1997 in order to intervene and resolve the pollution of the Vaal River system. The Vaal River system crisis is grouped into three main areas: infrastructure, governance, and institutional capacity and finance. An amount of 1.1 billion rand over the next 3 years has been set aside for refurbishment of the waste water treatment plants. A further 700 million rand over the next 3 years has also been set aside to add more capacity on the sewer network. The minister also confirmed that the department had started putting out requests and advertising for engineers, only South African engineers, she said.
Do you know what's happening with this Vaal pollution? Do you know when it started or who is affected?
The Vaal River system is polluted beyond acceptable standards. The main problem is that the sewer drainage system has been damaged extensively. This includes the near destruction of wastewater treatment plants. You ask, when did it start? It's been a problem for the past 15 years. So since 2006, it's been a long time. The system is very big. It spans through 3 provinces and 2 countries. So who is affected? It's 19 million people depend on the system's waters for drinking, for industrial use, and commercial use. Yeah. I mean, Gauteng is the economic hub of South Africa. So anything that affects Gauteng basically affects the entire country. And this water, and Gauteng is a dry province, and it depends on this water. This water is piped through from the Lesotho Highlands Water Project. So the water goes for hundreds of kilometers to the Gauteng area, and in the Gauteng area, it gets polluted because it's a highly densely populated province. Yeah.
They're obviously affecting about a third of the country's population. That's very significant.
It's a big number. It's a big number.
On that note, let me take us through the stories from Africa this week. Our first story is the Libyan ceasefire signals new hope. The United Nations Secretary General's Special Envoy for Libya and the head of the United Nations Support Mission in Libya, UNSMIL, Jan Koubis, has outlined progress made since the agreement of a ceasefire in October 2020. The launch of a Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, the LPDF, and the start of a process for reunifying Libyan state institutions is amongst the progress that has been achieved. The LPDF roadmap and resolutions of the United Nations Security Council have established a pathway for the Libyan parliament and presidential elections to be held on 24 December 2021. The LPDF held a preliminary meeting this week and discussed key issues such as the election plans and sequence of events, such as whether to hold elections first versus finalizing the constitutional progress first.
Have the guns stopped completely, or are there still isolated skirmishes? If they're still fighting, won't that jeopardize prospects for a peaceful, credible election period?
Sure. Well, it seems as though there's still confidence in the ceasefire agreement, which is also endorsed by the United Nations Security Council, even though there have been the occasional clashes between armed groups. In recent months, though, hundreds of prisoners and detainees were released by both sides, with releases taking place mostly weekly in different parts of the country during the month of Ramadan. However, the process on key issues such as the reopening of the main coastal road and the withdrawal of foreign mercenaries and foreign fighters, which are part of the ceasefire agreement, are still being stalled. So there seems to be some clashes, but this ceasefire is still one that enables confidence nonetheless. On to our next story. The DRC's Mt Nyiragongo erupts. Hundreds of children and families in the DRC's Goma district are at risk following the volcanic eruption of Mt Nyiragongo. The United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, reported that more than 150 children had been separated from their families and more than 170 are feared to be missing. More than 5,000 people crossed the border into Rwanda from Goma as the slow-moving lava spewed, and at least 25,000 were displaced in Sake, which is 25 kilometers northwest of Goma. The last time Nyiragongo erupted in 2002, well over 100,000 were left homeless, and around 250 people were reportedly killed. This is one of the world's most active volcanoes and deadliest eruption from the lava lake, reportedly, which led to the deaths of more than 600 in 1977.
Was this eruption not predicted by an early warning system?
Well, it seems as though they do have early warning systems established, but they weren't as effective as one would have hoped in this instance. So the challenge is that the size of the DRC and the isolation of certain regions make rapid humanitarian response extremely difficult. However, in July 2020, the CRS, the Christian group in the DRC, partnered with UNICEF and the Diocesan Caritas partners to create a community-based early warning system to increase information flow from vulnerable communities in 3 provinces to provincial and national authorities and decision makers. The early warning system led to an establishment of 7 community-based disaster preparedness programs in high-risk villages and building of local capacity to mitigate disasters. So the EWS early warning system has been proven as a viable information disseminating tool in man-made and natural disaster preparedness. As a result of the early warning system, communities are now better informed about the equipped to deal with disasters. As intervention plans and strategies have been better structured, response times have also been significantly shortened. And I think that's why we're also seeing a progressively smaller group of fatalities coming out of this eruption, despite the fact that the region has also been marred by violence. As we know, there's extreme violence from rebel groups from neighboring countries. There's also domestic groups which are active in the eastern parts of the DRC, where the Goma region is. Our next story this week is about Africa Day. Ubuntunomics wishes all our African listeners a blessed month with the commemoration of Africa Day this week. In Swahili, we say to you all, umoja ni nguvu, utengano ni udafu, which loosely translates to unity is strength, separation is weakness. And on to our next story. Somalia summit resumes political talks. After months of escalating tension, a summit involving leaders of Somalia's political factions is underway in Mogadishu. The political process to implement elections in East Somalia has faced many obstacles in recent months. Talks between the federal government and federal member state leaders that began in March broke down in early April. The House of Peoples of the Somalia Parliament then adopted a special law abandoning the 17 September electoral agreement, reverting to a one-person, one-vote model and extending the mandates of the current office holders up to 2 more years. However, opposition to these moves led to the mobilization of militia and exposed divisions within Somalia's security forces. Violent clashes ensued on the 25th of April, risking broader conflict, and the House of People reversed its special law on the 1st of May under tense pressure and at the request of President Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed. President Mohamed has empowered Prime Minister Mohamed Hussein Robo to lead the federal government's involvement in the electoral process and oversee security arrangements. Talks in Mogadishu's summit centered on resolving the outstanding issues related to the implementation of the 17 September agreement and matters related to the upcoming elections.
Are there still peacekeeping forces in the country? If there are, what is their current role during this transition period?
It seems unclear as to whether the UN has troops still present in Somalia or not. But what is very clear is that the mission, in terms of whether it's a peacekeeping mission or a political or peace-building mission, is that the UNISOM, which is the United Nations Somalia operation, is currently classified as a political and peace-building operation, which one would expect to be without military troops. But as I say, it seems unclear as to whether they've got any troops who are still active in Somalia or not.
I see.
And leading on to our last story this week, the UN Security Council on the Mali crisis. The UN Security Council met to discuss the derailing of Mali's transitional government following the apparent forced resignation and detainment of both the president and prime minister. Colonel Assimi Goïta, who led the August 2020 military coup, detained the president and prime minister because they had failed to consult him over a government reshuffle. The local transition monitoring committee, made up of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, the African Union, AU, and the United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, MINUSMA, including France, the United States, and the United Kingdom, Germany, and the European Union, all expressed their deep concern at the situation in Mali. MINUSMA was established in April 2013 and has a total of some 14,700 troops and police from 65 different countries. MINUSMA is also one of the United Nations' deadliest missions, with 245 peacekeepers having lost their lives while on active duty, of which 144 are due to malicious acts and the rest due to disease and accidents.
Yeah, this sounds like another Myanmar. Who is the head of government in Mali? What I'm trying to get at is what powers does the military have in regards to that, to the head of government?
So currently, Colonel Guaita has taken over as the interim president after the resignation of both president and prime minister. And I think, as previously, he will then hold the government for a limited period of time up until the next elections or the next president, prime minister are elected as to resume the role. But constitutionally, it is actually the president who is the head of state in Mali. I'm not certain, though, whether they will hold new elections or whether they will try to reinstate or to reverse the current resignation of the president and prime minister in order to reinstate them and avoid the reshuffle. At this point, it is, though, Colonel Guaita who's currently the interim president, and hence he is the head of state in Mali. On that note, that brings an end to our stories this week.